Hello and welcome to the next episode of Censored but Not Silenced. We are delivering unbiased intelligence analysis and speaking truth to power. As the 50th day of Putin's brutal war on Ukraine is approaching, devastation, demolition of cities, Ukrainians, mothers and children are not spared by brutality. Many Western analysts are puzzled at the ferocity with which Putin is waging this war. What is it about the Russian culture that is driving this man? I have a very amazing guest for you today who will decode some of the puzzles about the Russian culture for us. Introducing writer and an amazing intellectual, Lesley Chamberlain. Welcome, Lesley.
Lovely to be here. Lovely to be here.
Why have we chosen Ms. Chamberlain to speak to us today? She is perfectly positioned because she understands the Russian culture. She has spent time in Russia, and also she recently penned a book about a single figure who had a profound impact on Russian education, Russian thought, and the Russian mindset. Lesley, tell us, before we go into discussing your book, actually, which is an amazing book that I would like to introduce to readers, Ministry of Darkness, How Sergei Uvarov Created Conservative Modern Russia. Before we get into the book discussion, please tell us, how did you get to know Russia?
Oh, well, that was a very long time ago. I actually learnt Russian at school, and nobody told me at the time, but I think post-war, Britain wanted more and the West wanted many more Russian graduates, and so Russian was this kind of extra subject at school for those of us who were good at languages. I was really a Germanist, but anyway, I was drawn into learning Russian, and then I went to university to study German, and I was again drawn into study Russian, and then I spent a lot of time doing research. But then I was offered a wonderful job at Reuters news agency, and I went to Moscow and lived in Moscow and worked for Reuters, 1978, 1979, the height of the Cold War. Jimmy Carter was president of the United States, and it was an amazing experience.
That is terrific. Yes, it was indeed the height of the Cold War. I remember it. As many of my listeners know, I was born and raised behind the Iron Curtain in the former Soviet Union. And I went to school at the Moscow National University, Pedagogical University, to learn English, just like you learned Russian, Lesley. Right. I learned English. So we both understand the importance of really realizing that the different cultures are not the same. Different people don't think the same. I am amazed currently as a national security consultant and former DIA intelligence officer at how little understanding there is in the West, about Putin and the Russian culture. I try to explain to people why, Putin thinks the way that he does. And I remember reading that you went when you were 19 years old, you went to Munich, I think.
Yes.
And one of the things that you said, you not only you wanted to experience living in another culture, you wanted to experience life in different countries, but also the feeling of lives with different histories and languages. And that is such a profound, statement. Talk to us a little bit about that. Not only, I understand you not only know the Russian culture very well, but the German culture. Tell us about the otherness of other cultures.
I would say in the first instance, it actually distanced me from my own culture a little bit, so that I felt that I could be more responsive to multiple cultures. I mean, I think to talk about that too much would take us too far from our topic today. But I was very, very immersed in German culture, and actually, it was one of the ways in which I came to Russia was through the German fascination with Russia. And at the beginning of the 20th century, German writers, German philosophers were hugely interested in Russia. Here was a country that was modernizing differently, that still, I think, because Russia modernized so late, even later than Germany, there was a very great conservative appeal to that late 19th century Russia. So, for instance, a writer like Thomas Mann found that Russia didn't have all the intellectual complications of Germany, German philosophy, and so on. And I've recently been writing about the poet Rilke, and he loved the simplicity of peasant culture in Russia. We know that he had a rather one-sided view of Russia, but nevertheless, it was quite common to love the Russian soul. That even got through to Britain, I think. I don't think we're very sentimental in that way, but it did get through. And then when the revolution came, those lovers of the Russian soul, they couldn't really understand how could this be the same Russia. I mean, Rilke was completely puzzled by that. So I think there is a great sympathy for Russia, which still continues because of this sense of a great Russian soul. And it's very hard to match that to the political reality that we see every now and again. I mean, we saw it during the Cold War. We're seeing it again now. You know, that hasn't zero sentimental appeal. It hasn't zero idealistic appeal. How can these two cultural forces emanate from the same place, from the same culture?
I know, isn't it amazing? There seems to be a paradox, or a disconnect. How do you reconcile this? And as an intelligence officer, I remember I would be telling my customers who were senior officials in the Pentagon, in the White House, in Congress. I briefed NATO, and I would explain to them the differences in Russian mentality, why the Russian people elected Putin 4 times, right? Why currently Putin's popularity, since he started waging this atrocious war on Ukraine, actually skyrocketed. It's at 83%. Now, everyone is stunned. And so let's talk about, this is you mentioned conservatism, right? So I really want to go and talk about this amazing book. Tell us about this man, Sergei Uvarov, and what kind of imprint did he have on the Russian thought, and talk specifically about the differences, between the Western conservative, Russian conservative.
Sergei Uvarov was born into the nobility in 1786. His father was briefly at the court of Catherine the Great, and Catherine the Great was Uvarov's godmother. So he was born into a very privileged position, but in fact he came from a slightly dodgy family. His father disappeared, his mother was a spendthrift and a sort of a social liability, we might say today. Her behavior wasn't quite right for the court. And so he grew up both very privileged and rather anxious about his position. By the time he was in his late teens, he showed extraordinary promise, intellectual promise. He joined he was a cadet at the foreign ministry, and he was sent to Vienna. This was Vienna at the time when Vienna was sheltering fugitives from Napoleon. So he met Madame de Stael, and he met a number of sort of French aristocratic fugitives from the French Revolution. And I suppose one of the main points about my book is to talk about how he was a founding force in designing the Russian response to the French Revolution. And I explain this in terms of a formula that he came up with. He went to work, he worked as in the foreign ministry abroad, and then he decided to make his career in Russia. That in itself is a very interesting decision, I think, because I was always fascinated by somebody who had a wonderful European education, quite a liberal European education, could then go back to Russia and be an arch conservative. I mean, he knew what he was going back to. He created himself as a liberalizing force, and he was constantly knocked back into more conservative positions. So one way of looking at his career, which is probably not terribly relevant to what we're talking about today, is actually to look at the plight of somebody who's more liberal than the regime of the time. I mean, he passed through a number of regimes. He started off with a very liberal Tsar, Alexander I, and then Alexander became much more reactionary, and so Uvarov, he suffered in his young career, and then he obviously realized that he was going to have to fit in, he was going to have to conform, and he did that, and he became a kind of arch conservative under the next Tsar, Nicholas I.
So that's incredible. I remember reading that he actually made education available to the serfs, right?
That's right, yes.
What can be more liberal than that? So what I'm hearing from you is that all these paradoxes that were within this man's, soul, character, were somewhat forced on him by the environment.
I think that's right. I mean, I believe that he was convinced that Russia was a special case, that there was a cause for Russian conservatism in the face of a much more liberal Western idea of modern culture, modern European civilization. And so that's where I would begin with him. So I don't think it's a coincidence that he came up with what is always called a tripartite slogan. And if you think of the French Revolution, yes, liberty, equality, fraternity. And Uvarov came up with this, I think, a sort of equal and opposite slogan, which was Orthodoxy, Pravoslavia, Autocracy, and Samodержавие, and Narodnost, which needs to be translated as official nationality. So an idea of the Russian people, an idea that it needs to be steered by an autocratic power at its head. And the orthodoxy, well, it could be the church, or I think it applied equally in Soviet times. It's that we're all going to think one thing, and we're going to revere it. As you know, there's a very famous poem in Russian by Turchev, which says that, Russia is something that you can only believe in. You can't, yes. And I think that if we today were looking for a way of marrying those two Russias that we find so hard to put together, this passionate, emotional, artistic culture tied to the soil, tied to the vision of great Russia, and this rather vicious political conservatism, it's somewhere in there, in this belief of what is Russia and how it's different from the West, and how it's always going to be different from the West, and that's almost a religious position.
That is so beautifully said and eloquently described, and captures the essence, in my view, of what the Russian culture is, the Russian soul, if you will. I am, ethnically Russian. I was born and raised there. My cognitive process was formed there. I immigrated to the United States at 24. And
Gosh, that's right, yeah.
Yes.
And I went to Russia when I was 26, so it's about the same time. Yeah.
So I right now I lived in the United States longer than I lived in Russia at this point. And so I pride myself in my ability to think both like a Russian and like an American. And this is what I brought to the table when I served in the US Defense Intelligence Agency, which is a military counterpart to CIA. And so what I wanted to talk a little bit more about is this phrase that you said, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. It captures so well Putin's mindset, in my view. And, many people think that Putin is just this new, conservative Russian leader, and he's brought this new ideology, and he certainly is playing the part. He wears a cross, under his clothing. Obviously, he managed to convince former US President George Bush that he was a Christian, by telling him a story about his grandmother baptizing him. And to me, this was, sounded more like a covert influence intelligence operation, because he couldn't have possibly gotten into the KGB. If he were indeed religious, religion was outlawed in the former Soviet Union. And you probably, I'm sure since you traveled there, Russia was officially an atheist state. And so do you see in Putin's behavior right now, as we're watching what he's doing in Ukraine, and as we were watching this whole Putin's playbook, which is the title of my book, do you see the reflection of that thought, of this formula that Uvarov has created: orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality? How much of it is genuine? How much of it is sort of to portray an image of somebody who can appeal to, let's say, Western conservatives, who, in my view, don't fully understand the difference between the two? Can you characterize, like, kind of grounding it in Uvarov's philosophy?
I mean, right at the start, when Catherine the Great also tried to formulate her view of the French Revolution, and she actually wrote to Edmund Burke, a great British Irish conservative, and said, we have a great deal in common in rejecting the French Revolution. And Burke immediately said, no, madam, we don't. Our views are rather different. One very important omission from I think Russian political statements is the omission of liberty. I think I was always struck by the Soviet Union being it was viewed from the West as the realization of a left-wing political ideal. But it was never concerned with liberty. It was never concerned with individuality. And that, for me, was, I think that the left in the West is concerned with liberty. So we have a very particular Russian phenomenon here, which is very, very authoritarian, very nationalistic. And both those forces were very prominent in Soviet culture, as far as I was concerned. I mean, the Marxism and the internationalism were mostly a veneer. Not, I don't think totally, but mostly. So Russia created a particular kind of conservatism, which essentially protected its view of its modernity. Because after all, Russia, as you know, in Soviet times, Russia wanted to be another United States, but on its own terms. It wanted the wealth. It wanted the super industrialization. It wanted the military power. It wanted the prestige in the world, but on its own terms. And then, of course, Russia in the 19th century also wanted to be an empire. Was an empire. and still is pushing that agenda. I think we have to remember that I always think when I think about Russia, there's a disjunct in chronology. You know, it always used to be said when we were, let's say, arrogant Westerners in Moscow in the 1970s, this country is 50 years behind. Let me try to take the arrogance out of it and just say that there is a historical disjunct there, so that Russia seems to be operating according to standards which politically in the West are just very, very much in the past. And that's part of our problem.
You just nailed a few points, excellent points. First is that there's lack of liberalism in Russian political thought, which is exactly correct. Basically what I described to some of my, again, customers, the senior officials who need to make political decisions, even wartime decisions, is that Russia is about collectivism, US and the West is about individualism. So there's a reason why the Russians traditionally gravitate towards an authoritarian type of leader. Even Putin was created by the same culture that produced Ivan the Terrible, who killed his own son, right? Or Joseph Stalin, who murdered millions of the Russian people. And the Russian history is just filled with wars. Most of them came from the West, with the exception of the Mongol Tatar yoke. And so somehow they decided that in order to keep security and stability, they need a strong and secure state.
I did some work, quite a lot of work on Russian philosophy for a previous book called Motherland, a philosophical history of Russia. And I was astonished to find, and I often quote this statement by a Russian philosopher who I think was still alive in 1990, called Yezer. And he defined Russian philosophy in such an extraordinary way. I thought, well, none of my philosophical colleagues in the West will accept this as philosophy. But Yezer said, philosophy in Russia is a central part of the culture, and the aim of the culture is to hold Russia together. And this is a society and a culture which constantly tends to break away, is naturally schismatic. This is almost the opposite of what you're saying, but it creates that tension in Russian culture that if we don't hold on to it centrally, also with tools like soft tools like philosophy, like culture, this idea, if we don't hold on to it with this idea of Russian uniqueness, it's all going to fall apart. We let's say that's because we might say from the West, because civil society is weak, because of so many decades, centuries of collectivism. Whatever the reason, it's a very, very difficult society to hold together if you've only got a liberal politics.
That is so true. And this is reflected in Putin's policy of promoting this so-called the Russian world, Ruski Mir. In fact, yes, the idea of this Ruski Mir, the Russian world, has been codified in several strategic planning documents, the foreign policy concept, the national security strategy, and Putin wants to reunite all the Russian people all over the world back into the Russian world, not physically necessarily, but in some cases definitely physically, but also intellectually and emotionally. And interesting, the way that he defines the Russian people is not just those who are born Russian, ethnically Russian, speak Russian, but also someone who is aligned with Russia in terms of their thinking, in terms of their philosophy. What you said, I don't know that book that you, Motherland, right? Tell us.
Motherland. Yes.
I cannot wait to buy it and read it. Is that on Amazon?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay, great. I want to read a quote for the listeners from your book. We're talking with the British writer Lesley Chamberlain and her amazing book, The Ministry of Darkness: How Sergei Uvarov Created Conservative Modern Russia. So you were talking about the French and the how basically the Russians were interpreting what was going on during the time of the 1812 campaign, Napoleon's campaign. So religion, honor, and patriotism were close to what official propaganda has distilled from the 1812 campaign as the essence of Russia: resignation to the will of God, devotion to the Tsar, and loyalty to the honor of Russia. And they grounded him in his own country and among his own people. Tell us more about this. This is, to me, just like such a quintessential quote. I love it.
Well, I suppose this is the first move on in defining the Russian response to the French Revolution. So it's Russia is certainly not going to go down the revolutionary path as had been witnessed in revolutionary France. And then with the Napoleonic campaign, you get an opportunity to formulate this nascent 19th century Russianness in very conservative terms, which take the position against revolution and put it into a new positive context in Russia, that it's going to be a religious state, that it's going to be very strongly nationalist in its understanding, and it's not going to. I mean, you say about Ruski Mir. This is. It's a very difficult concept for us, isn't it? Of a people that's not going to allow any dilution of itself. I mean, it seems as if Putin wants to concentrate this Russianness, even as it's spread across the world. And you could take this campaign against Napoleon as one of the first moments in which that attitude, that policy, that belief was felt by people. I mean, I think they did. There was a very, very, very strong Russian conservatism on the ground, which my poor man Uvarov, I mean, it made him look like an ultra liberal because he believed in education. So, I mean, I did write this book partly out of sympathy for him, because I mean, he had really a wonderful program in education, and he had many German political friends, who were very cautious liberals. And I think he was trying to steer a path, and trying to steer a subtle path in Russia is a very difficult thing, as you know.
Yes, it is.
It's a crude polity. It's vicious. I mean, to go back to something you said earlier, I remember going to the opera in Moscow, and it was a performance of Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov, and there is a moment when the ailing leader tells his son that he has to take over as the next leader of Russia. And in this production, I've never seen this done in the West, in this production, the father hurled his son across the stage onto the throne. And the force of that gesture, I mean, it's never left me. It's something I don't know elsewhere. So yes, orthodoxy, nationality, religious intensity, and brute force. We would add that to our trinity.
So eloquently said. Yes, brute force. This is something. It's terrifying. Yes, and it's unraveling right now. Right in front of our eyes, and we see maternity hospitals targeted. We see, I think, amazingly, let me see the numbers right now. In total, more than 4.6 million Ukrainians have now fled the country.
Yes.
We've seen Putin using chemical warfare in Ukraine, albeit in the asymmetric way. He targeted Sumy, where the chemical plant was struck, creating ammonia leak. He appointed Alexander Dvornikov, who has experience using chemical weapons in Syria, in the final phases of the campaign before he's going to wrap it up, at least the active combat phase, by May 9th, which is a huge Russian holiday, as you
Yes,
know.
of course. Yes.
77th anniversary of Russia's victory in what they call Great Patriotic War. So patriotism is what ostensibly, driving it, but also exceptionalism. You noted the sense of exceptionalism, and it's not just the Russian leaders, it's the Russian people also, just like Americans, believe that Americans are exceptional, and the Russian people believe they're truly exceptional, as you just described here. And so what I want to ask you is that I've seen people in the intelligence community and in the Washington national security apparatus who have never set foot in the target country, don't speak the language, whether it's Russian, Chinese, or any other, and they produce analysis, intelligence analysis about their target. And sometimes it's stunning to me how's that even possible? And one can wonder, or rather not wonder, why there are a lot of decisions that have been made with regard to Russia, China, Afghanistan, you name it, right? Do you think, in your view, having lived in various countries and cultures and speaking foreign languages, do you think it's even possible to understand, the intelligence target, and by that I mean your account, like my account is, Putin and Russian doctrine strategy. And I, know it inside and out. Do you think it's possible for somebody who's never been in the country, doesn't speak the language, to make sound analytical conclusions about the target, about another culture and country?
Well, it doesn't sound a very plausible way to go about things, and I must say that my great example is 1991, when I think the West, but definitely led by American analysis, truly believed that Russia would turn overnight into a country like the United States, and I felt almost rage at the time. I felt horror, because I thought, well, whatever Russia is, I know that it needs to go its own way. I know that it can't turn into America tomorrow. And I know that for lots of cultural and philosophical reasons, there's resistance to a capitalist system in Russia. There's resistance to a liberal polity. And I do think that in the West, we have to respect that. Russia is a country that I do believe, is entitled to run itself in its own way. We just don't want it to spill over into our world. And I think Ukraine, for me, in 2014 was a slightly difficult issue, because I did think of Crimea, because I'm steeped in Russian culture. I did think of Crimea as a Russian place. I mean, I don't know how it.
That's amazing. I'm sure I will be called Putin's puppet, but that's how I think about it, because I am ethnically Russian. My cognitive process was formed in Russia. I studied Russian history. to me, Crimea is Russian, but you can't say something like that on TV, God forbid, right?
Yeah.
So I already
So,
feel.
I've said it for you, but I mean, I have a different view now, retrospectively. Ukraine is a sovereign country. Those are the rules of the game
Right.
in the 21st century, and that takes us back to that problem with Russia seeming to exist in a slightly different, in a different political age. And I suppose that they can defend that by saying, well, we're Russia, we do it differently. We don't want your version of modernity, we want ours.
Right.
And for that, they need a large area of the world, they need a big economy, they need the Eurasian idea. So they can make it work, they can make it happen.
And
I
that's
think,
the problem. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah.
you mentioned Eurasia. So that's how the Russians think, and that's kind of the crux of the matter. The war in Ukraine, right, or Russia's war, Putin's war on Ukraine, is not
Yes.
about Ukraine at all. It's a proxy war between Russia and the United States and NATO, because there was a super classified US policy that is now unclassified, that basically envisions that the United States will do everything possible to prevent the emergence of a dominant power in Eurasia. And by that dominant power, we obviously mean Russia, and possibly China. And so Russia knows this. Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote this book called The Global Chessboard. And one of the quotes from that book that the Russians took to heart is, that who controls Eurasia controls the world. So the Russians have watched the US and NATO's behavior for the past 20 years. The invasions, in their view, those are invasions that I'm about to articulate: Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. And so they have decided that it's just a matter of time before we invade Russia or conduct regime change, as tragically our president just verbalized, even
yes, that was a mistake.
And so it just feeds into Putin's paranoia, right? And so we are now on the geopolitical collision course, with Russia, the West and Russia. And so you mentioned that they should be allowed to pursue their own path, which is what Putin wants and what the Russians want. They don't want democracy, because, as you said, they had a terrible experience with democracy in the 90s.
They did.
They call it
I was in Moscow in 1993, 94, 95, 96. I saw, 92, central Moscow was full of, I think you call them yard sales in America. We call them car boot sales. I mean, people were selling one cup, one hairbrush, spreading out whatever they had that they thought they could sell on a rug on the ground in central Moscow or on a table. I walked past the Bolshoi. They were selling off conductors' scores, musical scores. I mean, it was the total destruction, the total humiliation of that culture. And as a lover of Russia, I minded.
Oh, of course. I minded it because I visited my, family in 93.
Yes.
My mother was actually, dying at that time, courtesy of the wonderful free medical care, Soviet medical care. And I came and I found that all of the books were gone in our apartment, all of any kind of valuables, my mom's crystal, and we had like a tremendous library, like wonderful books. Everything was gone because they couldn't feed themselves, Lesley. So describe, like, to our listeners and viewers, why? I mean, you just did in a way, but can you spend a little more time like describing what democracy means to the Russians? That I'm trying to like to make people understand that when they try to like promote this whole democracy mantra with the Russians, with Ukrainians, it means something else to them, and why?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think in a better hour, Putin did give us the formula. I think when he first came to power, he tried to explain a few things to the West, and I think we did look past them. One of those concepts was managed democracy. Managed democracy.
Mhm.
Uvarov would have understood that. Uvarov was about, in a way, a managed liberalization, managed opening up of education. I mean, I think just to go back to Uvarov, I mean, what he was trying to do was say, well, we're going to try to achieve the same cultural level as the developed Western countries. This is we're back in the 19th century, and for that we need um, great advances in science. We need to support our scientists. We need to support education. We need to send our students abroad, but we're not going to give up our Russianness. And so that combination of a kind of openness to the world in order to boost scientific achievement, which we've seen. I mean, Russia is a great scientific country and a great cultural power. It's just
Yeah, the
this.
Russians are the ones who sent the Sputnik, first. They sent
Absolutely,
a human into space. I mean, there's a lot of, we still watch the Nutcracker every,
of course.
Christmas, right? It's given to us,
Yes,
this one lake. People don't realize the table of Mendeleev, the
yes,
chemical
yes,
elements. So go
yes,
ahead.
yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, no, no. So the way we're talking, I think, is if you were wanting to advise those cultural and those intelligence analysts who didn't have Russian, who'd never visited the country, yes, it's a disaster because you've got to understand the culture. You've got to understand what makes people proud, what they love about their own country. I think that's really important. And I think I had the privilege of that by living in Russia. And actually, it was quite difficult for me in Soviet times. And my colleagues said, "Oh, you must be pro-Soviet, Lesley." I said, "No, no, nowhere near." But I am. I'm overwhelmed by this country. I'm actually overwhelmed. In Soviet times, I was overwhelmed with sympathy because it was so, as you know, so poor, and through Western eyes, so much more poor than it probably was, but so poor. So there was so much suffering, so much ill health, so many lives not coming to anything, so many lives not realized. That was almost the idea that dominated when I was there. I thought, well, how is it that you can take opportunity away from millions of people? Each generation that's born is not going to be able to live a good life here. Good in the sense of being able to realize their talents, to be diverse people, those things that we do respect in the West, but we're actually closing opportunities down in our own way at the moment. I was very sympathetic to Russia, but not in political terms.
Right. Yes.
And I think it's important for any analyst to have that cultural sympathy, yes, and to understand complex, paradoxical people like Uvarov, who's being pulled in all directions. Okay, so he's not got Western liberal ideals, but he's got some good things for Russia that he really wants to see happen. People say, "Oh, actually, look, he didn't like Russia. He wrote in French." He's an extraordinarily interesting figure, one of the last Russian writers in French. If you look him up, he's in French encyclopedias because a lot of his work was published in French. Perhaps he didn't like, he was no friend of peasant Russia, but from what I read, his own peasants on his estate, they loved him. It's a very, very paradoxical and difficult culture to understand. So I absolutely endorse what you say, that those analysts need to get out there and really, really grasp it.
and really do basically get qualified for their jobs, because what I've seen is like if you are a doctor you have the medical degree, right? And I've seen people like an equivalent of doing surgery without actually having the medical degree. And like, how's that even possible? So something is very interesting that you said about the complexity of this man, Sergei Uvarov. So Putin is a pariah right now. Obviously, you know, he deserves to burn in hell for what he did to the Ukrainian people, to the brother Slavic nation. And many people believe he's actually crazy in the sense that he's mentally, you know, unstable. Do you, if you were to analyze him and kind of put it in the context of this conservative philosophy, do you that was espoused by Uvarov, how would you characterize this man? You know, is he crazy? Is he a Russian nationalist? Obviously, nobody's, you know, pro-Putin here. You know, I wrote a book disclosing what he was up to. You know, you stated clearly that you are not pro-Soviet and you don't agree with the political aspect of the whole culture. Characterize in an unbiased, kind of straightforward, unemotional way this man.
Well, I hesitate to call him crazy because that takes, I mean, if we mean that seriously, that he's mentally ill or even physically ill, so physically ill that it's affecting his judgment. I think if we go down that path, we take some element of responsibility away from him. And so I'm a little bit loath to do that. He does look rather ill to me. I mean, I'm not an analyst, but I don't think we can take that to be a reason. I think he's an ardent Russian nationalist, and I think he's got absolute cutthroat techniques. Something I also quote in my philosophy book, Motherland, is the view of Russian intellectuals this is in 1909, in a very important collection of essays called Landmarks. And there, the philosopher Berdyaev, who felt let down by his fellow Russian intellectuals. I mean, we haven't talked about the role of the Russian intelligentsia, which seems completely squashed in this current situation. But Berdyaev really minded. He said, our Russian intellectual culture doesn't care to distinguish between true and false. And I've always been very, very struck by that. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible indictment, but I often think it when I read the denials and the extraordinary sort of fantasy explanations of things in Russian politics. It's not that we don't have our own fantasists and liars in the West, but there does seem to be a particular facility for not only lying but self-deception on the Russian political part. And in a way, I can only speculate here. I've never met Putin. I imagine he's conscious of that he can use these tendencies, these traditions of lying and deceit and fear. He can instrumentalize them. He can use them to maximize his power. So in that way, I would say, I suspect he's totally cynical. At the same time as being a Russian nationalist, perhaps he believes he's a Christian. He believes because the political tradition in Russia is either to, as it were, instrumentalize the church, co-opt it totally. I mean, it was pretty corrupt under the Tsars. It was completely as it were, completely instrumentalized in Soviet times. I mean, it did function, didn't it, kind of in the background, but it was a source of just another arm of politics, really. So it's a very, very cynical political tradition, and it's hard for me to see how anything fresh can come into it, anything critical, because criticism costs you your life in Russia.
That is true. That is so astute, such an astute observation, Lesley. Could you please repeat this quote by Berdyaev? I just find it stunning. I didn't know that quote.
yes, it's that the Russian intelligentsia doesn't care to distinguish between true and false.
That is just
I could find it for you. I'd have to leave the conversation, but it's in my book Motherland, and in my work in philosophy, I found many clues to what makes Russia the place it is. And I'm going to leave out the evaluation there. Just this is how it is. It even turns philosophy into something else. You know,
it,
if you're a philosopher in the West, I mean, philosophy has got itself into a lot of difficulties now. A lot of it's postmodern, you know, as it were, post-truth, or it's very, very narrow and so analytical that it doesn't seem to be relevant to everyday life. But I still think that most Western philosophers would find it shocking to see Russian philosophy as a phenomenon from the 19th century, so politicized, so instrumentalized, so unfree to think its own thoughts. At the same time, it's a marvelous source of social idealism, of social responsibility, of a desire for equality, of a desire for social justice. We know this from, you know, Russian thinkers in the 19th century. So again, if I were an analyst and if I were coming to the phenomenon of Russia, say, and as I said, 1991 was really the crucial year for me, I would say, well, you know, this is a formidable tradition in social justice. It's also a formidable, in a negative sense, tradition in political tyranny. And anybody from outside has to understand those two things. It almost brings tears to my eyes as I try to express it now, because you can't marry those two traditions, and yet they are Russia, this passionate desire for social justice, this immensely powerful art, and by that I mean the music, the
yes.
literature, and so on, and this terrible, vicious political tradition, which it almost seems that it's part of the culture to say, well, yes, we need that. We have to have that. So we're not going to worry about it.
What do I sometimes think, Lesley, is that one is there almost like a prerequisite to the other, because yes. I remember during the times of the Soviet Union, we were so afraid to speak the truth. You know, there's censorship, there's a constant, you know, fear that somebody can overhear, and if you're critical about the authorities, they could, you know, somebody could turn you in. And so we had these kitchen conversations, right, that were the most, you know, profound, the most intellectual conversation, deep. Literature was amazing. And I look right now at the Russian culture from this side of the ocean, if you will, and there's so much like trashiness, if you will, and it seems to me that they have adopted all of the sort of negative things about the Western culture and all the Hollywood stuff and all the cheap sort of novel traditions, and it's almost like when there was oppression. It's a terrible thing to say, and certainly I don't want to go live there, you know, under oppression. But it seems to me that when people are oppressed, they find like an incredibly innovative ways, creative ways to get the truth out, to get their feelings out. And
absolutely.
I don't know what you think about that.
Oh yes, I think that's the essence of the Russian culture that we love. We sometimes forget about the circumstances in which it was produced, but it is so powerful. So when I feel desperate about Russia, I sometimes say, well, it's a country that has magnificent art, but it has only art, and you can't live, you know, you can't live from art alone, as you can't live from bread alone, as it were. I don't think I can resolve Russia in my lifetime. It's a country that tears me apart. I have to confess that I haven't been back to Russia physically myself since 1996, because I thought, well, I used to be I knew that country in a way that other people couldn't know it. I had lived there. I spoke the language. I read the literature. I can be a spokesperson. But now this country is free. It doesn't need me to speak. And I mean, I think that's true. So I just make my observations on the sidelines. But I think it's an incredibly difficult problem, just not to be resolved. It's a culture that I can't resolve in my mind.
I don't think you're the first person or the last person. I don't think anybody can. Like you just described the art and the literature, and basically juxtaposed to that Russia has the most formidable military in the world that is second only to that of the United States. And Putin is the one who actually modernized that military to the state that it is right now. And if you take into consideration nuclear weapons, Russia actually beats, in terms of tactical nuclear weapons, the US 10-to-1 ratio. We have 200, Russia has 2,000. And so these two things are just like so irreconcilable, and yet they live in one country, in one culture, and that's what we're dealing with. The Russians actually concluded that a war between the United States and Russia is inevitable. I mean, that's another stunning, yes, that's what the intelligence services, because we effectively are fighting over the same territory, right? That we talked about earlier, over the control of Eurasia. Who the post-Soviet states like Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus are going to orient towards, right? Is it going to be the West, or is it going to be Russia? And we're just not being, honest in the West about the key drivers for Putin's war on Ukraine. Because in addition to the democracy, there's a security concern. And that security concern beats economic concerns. And this is why sanctions don't work. And it's a mess. And I think what you just said, that it is extremely important for those intelligence analysts to do their homework, to understand their target, to study and base their intelligence analysis based on reality, because Putin never made it a secret what he was going to do, right? I think you said it earlier, and I confirm every single speech, every single press conference, every strategic planning document, military doctrine, national security strategy spelled out very clearly what his plans were. And yet, we didn't develop a counter plan. And now we are blindsided. We're grasping at straws with these sanctions, and Ukrainians are in the middle, and they're just being slaughtered. And my heart is broken for them. So
that's absolutely true. But I don't know that we should. I'm uneasy with this idea of this being a war between the United States and Russia. I want to play that down. I want to tone it down.
Okay.
I want to minimize it as much as possible. And it does seem to me that it might have been possible for Putin not to have gone to war in his lifetime. It may be that, to come back to that idea that he might be ill, I don't want it to take away his mental capacity, but it might be a feeling that he's on his way out, that he wants to make the definitive gesture at the end of his career. I'm surprised by the war, shocked. I would want to play it down, to close it down, to close down that idea of military conflict. Let's not forget that, you're saying that the Russian military is immensely powerful, but it's proved itself, it's made an ass of itself in this war. It's killed a lot of people.
It did, but Lesley, what I tell people, yes, we're judging Russian military performance using Americans' warfighting standards, but the Russians are never fight the same way. And if you look at the sort of at the strategic goal of Putin, at least for this campaign, it's to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. And one of the requirements, the key requirements for NATO membership, is territorial integrity and sovereignty. And as long as Putin wages this war, which it is my intelligence assessment that he is going to continue, even after he wraps up the active combat phase, he's going to turn it into a grinding, protracted conflict, and then eventually into frozen conflict. He has met his objective. So to me, it's tactics is less important in terms of military performance. Obviously, it's atrocious, what he's doing, targeting civilian, but that's a deliberate military strategy.
Yeah, and also, the convoy stuck in the mud, the failure to take Kiev, and so on. I mean, this is humiliating. I mean, it's almost
totally.
As if they invite that upon themselves. But I mean, we've seen America humiliated on the battlefield as well in other war zones. So I mean, war is a risky thing if you're a proud country, and all countries are proud. So I think they deserve to be humiliated, all of them. I mean, I just hate it.
Absolutely. Not only humiliated by Putin, like I said, he just deserves to burn in hell. And yes, he wants to, maybe like you're correct that he feels he's on the way out, but he also wants to be Catherine the Great, right? You mentioned Catherine the Great earlier.
And the empires, yes, absolutely.
And all that stuff. So I want to wrap up here. I want to recommend again this book highly if you want to understand the Russian mindset, Putin's mindset, if you will, and try to decode this puzzle. There's no better book than Lesley Chamberlain's Ministry of Darkness, How Sergei Uvarov Created Conservative Modern Russia. Lesley, tell us please where else our audience can find your books. You've written 12 books, right? This is not the only one. Where can we go get it? How can they find? Are you on social media? Do you have a website? Tell us.
Oh, yes, all those things. Certainly I have a website, Lesley Chamberlain Co UK. I've written a number of books on Russia. I'd say that a companion volume to this one would definitely be my book Motherland, A Philosophical History of Russia. I also wrote a book called The Philosophy Steamer, Lenin and the Exile of the Intelligentsia, which is very interesting this year because it's 100 years, the anniversary of an event in 1922 when Lenin handpicked the Russian intellectuals whom he said were not allowed to stay in the future Soviet country because they would never come round to a Soviet point of view. And this included, I mentioned the philosopher Berdyaev just now, who was the philosopher who said that Russians have a problem distinguishing between true and false. That sounds trivial, but in the context, it's absolutely serious. So my book, The Philosophy Steamer, was the first book actually to tackle this historical event. I mean, it's an extraordinary event whereby 200 intellectuals and their families were rounded up and put on 2 German ships and sent to Germany. And Russians do have a way with rounding up people and sending them to faraway places. And in this case, they were sent to Europe, and they settled in Paris and in Berlin and in Prague and made new lives. And they were the Russian opposition of the time because they were opposed to the revolution, but actually not to the social ideals of the revolution. They were just expelled by the Bolsheviks because they didn't seem to be the right kind of material. And Trotsky said at the time, well, you should consider yourself lucky because if you'd stayed, you wouldn't have stayed alive. I mean, it's a fascinating story. Anyway, it's my book, The Philosophy Steamer, talks about that. Yes, so have a look at my website, Lesley Chamberlain Co UK. Have a look at my Russian books. Oh, they're all available on Amazon. Perhaps I should say here that it's a very different aspect of my work. But when I first began as a writer, I wanted to write about Russian food. Because I had the language, because I had the culture, And because I was in Soviet Russia, whereas food culture was somewhat was difficult, but you couldn't get the ingredients you wanted. They weren't really. There was only one cookery book, the official cookery book, and I thought, well, this is a really interesting culture with a really interesting history. I'll write a book about that. So that was my first book, and it's called The Food and Cooking of Russia. There's loads of history, loads of cultural background, and it's still in print. In the United States, actually, with an American university press. I think it's the University of Buffalo. So that's a sort of soft introduction to my interest in Russia. And Uvarov, that's a hard. that's the hard stuff. But I just want to say I do agree with you. I think that the drift now is going to be back. You mentioned the word frozen, frozen relations. I think we're seeing a drift back to a kind of Cold War, but at least that will give us some kind of peace and stasis. Maybe it's the best thing we can hope for.
At least for now.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It's been so terrific, magnificent episode. Lesley Chamberlain, a British author of Ministry of Darkness and 12 other books. You've been listening to Rebekah Koffler with Censored But Not Silenced. We deliver straightforward, unbiased intelligence analysis. We speak truth to power, even when others are afraid. If you like this episode, follow me on Twitter at Rebekah0132 and check out my website, RebekahKoffler.com, and be sure to pick up a copy of my book, Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America. And we have another book coming out on the 19th of April about Zelensky, Ukraine's president, who is the unlikely hero who defied Putin and united the world. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.